Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session, The Rise of Populism in America, What It Looks Like, Why It's Happened, and Prescriptions for Change. It's hard to imagine a more important issue that's facing this country and the world right now. There's clearly a sense, both in the US and around the world, that people have been left behind, and this has led to political earthquakes, whether that's in the UK, the US, Italy, or around the world. I'm really excited that we have gathered literally many of the foremost experts on populism in the world here today, and I'll explain how this is going to play out, but just know that I've told them that I don't want them all to agree, and we want to have a healthy debate here. So really looking forward to this, and we will take your questions at the end. The first part, James Manyika, who is chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute, is going to give a presentation, a quick presentation on the economic roots of populism, followed by Arthur Brooks, who's a scholar, a free enterprise scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. The second part, we're going to bring on Danielle Allen, who's a professor at Harvard University. She'll be interviewed by Derek Thompson from The Atlantic. And then in part three, we will bring everyone back to the stage, along with Jason Furman, who obviously was head of Obama's top economic advisor, now is teaching at Harvard, Chad Brown, a fellow at the Peterson Institute, Kevin Delaney, who's the editor of Quartz, and then Arthur and James. So this is going to be a great discussion, and with that, I'd like to introduce James.
Thank you, Becca. Well, thank you. Let's go back in time for a little bit. The year was 2015. And there were lots of political movements going on around the world. Many of us were starting to look at what was happening to people and incomes and prosperity and those kinds of questions. And so we did some work along with other academic friends looking at what was going on in the advanced economies. So what I'm about to describe here is generally true across many advanced economies, but spectacularly the case in a handful of them. The UK, the United States, France, Italy, and Austria. So what I'll show is emblematic of, although I'm mostly going to show US data, it's mostly emblematic of those particular 5 or 6 countries in particular. So where were we in 2015? We've all been talking about income inequality. 2015, this is how it roughly looked. So on the right-hand side, it shows you the bottom 50% of people in the United States, and the gray area shows you what share of wages and income they had out of the national total. So back in 1980, that number was about 20% or so. So it was about 20% or so. And then by 2014, it had come down, as you can see on the chart. On the right-hand side, what you see is what was happening to the 1% between 1980 and what happened in 2014. So you can see what happened here, massive shift in inequality. Well, let's look at something else. If you look at households through the lens of households, if you had looked, say, in the period, as you can see, 1993 to about 2005, and you'd ask the question, what percentage of US households are seeing their incomes as households stagnate or decline? The 2% number is what you see. Only 2% of US households are seeing the, if you like, market incomes, which means the wages that the household gets, and a little bit of investment if they have some, but for the most part, for most people, it's wages. For most households, it's wages. That's the 2% is the share of those of households that we're seeing their incomes stagnate or decline in real terms. So what that says is that everybody was largely progressively getting better off. And they're moving forward, and they could look to the future and look prosperous. So what happened if you look at the next period? So if you then ask the same question between the period 2005 and 2014, and you ask the question again, what share of US households saw their incomes stagnate or decline? That's the 81% number. That's pretty much everybody. This is through the lens of households. If you looked at the United Kingdom, that number is about 78%. If you looked at France, that number was also in the about 82%. So a massive shift. Now, of course, we know a big part of that was the crisis, financial crisis, because that's in the middle of that period. But this is still a staggering shift. And it's also interesting to see who was affected by that. So, in the prior period, this is back to 93 to 2005, all boats were rising. This is the period when people were getting progressively better off, and you can see incomes are rising across all the quintile, the groups here of income. Again, if you look at the period 2005, 2014, everybody got hammered, as it were. So this income stagnation pretty much affected all income groups. So that's a little bit of what was going on. If you then look at who was affected the most, now each of these bars represents levels of education. So the dark blue are the least educated, medium level of education, and the highly educated. And the groups show you by age cohort groups. So what you can see from this is basically the young and the less educated were impacted the most as this was going on. And you can do interesting things to also look at, for example, how did this look around the country? And this is looking at not so much at the state level, but at the county level to see where are the counties where this stagnation of income happened the most. And you kind of see the pattern of where that happened. Now, this is based on just economic data on the wages and incomes and so forth. So we did a lot of surveys, along with others did surveys, to look at, did people feel this? Did they feel this level of being left behind and stagnated? And so these are some of the survey results. Yes, as you can see, as you go to the right of this picture, more and more people were starting to feel that this wasn't quite working for them. The economy was leaving them behind. Their prospects looking forward were not as positive as they imagined. And so people were starting to feel this. This is, again, in 2014 and 2015. And in those same surveys, we also asked other attitudinal questions. And what you find is that a lot of the people who felt that this wasn't working for them generally also tended to be people who had relatively negative attitudes towards immigration, towards trade, and towards foreign labor. So there's a set of things that people highlighted when they're talking about as part of the explanation, rightly or wrongly, that they felt were some of the reasons for what was going on. So this is kind of interesting, back to this question, are there any economic underpinnings to what people were feeling at the time? And this might suggest they probably were. Now, what else was going on at the same time? If you look at these same periods, we were also going through a period of record corporate profits. As you can see, the highest corporate profits for 70-plus years in the same period. So you start to see how the picture of what was going on with households versus what was going on the other side looks quite different. Now, what else was going on in the economy at the time? One of the things that many economists are starting to look at is the left-hand side shows, for example, the share of the national income that goes towards wages. And what you can see is that share has been declining for some time. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, and we can have a fun economic debate and discussion about what's driving that. But as you can see, it's generally going down. I think no one disputes that. We can debate the reasons for it. And at the same time, if you look on the other side, which is the chart on the right, if you look back 50 or so years ago, it used to be the case that whenever we had economic growth and productivity growth, employment would also follow, and wage growth would also follow. That relationship doesn't seem to be as robust as it used to be. So even when we have economic growth, it's not clear that it quite lifts up wages to the same degree that it used to, which is also an interesting question. And then when we look forward, so this is now looking forward, we're starting now to think about the impact of things like automation and AI and so forth, and we think about how much better or worse does this picture get? And at least for now, it looks like it could be worrying, because what happens is many of the easily automatable jobs, or at least portions of them, tend to look like they're in the middle wage category. And this is just a picture of scenarios of looking at possibilities of what automation might do to wage and income. So I'll leave it at that, only to say I think we may have an economic underpinning to some of the feelings that have given rise to this. Now, Arthur will take it up next. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and thank you to all of you. I want to put a sociological spin on the economic facts that you've just heard from James. The people that you've heard about in the margins of society expressing opinions about not being at the center of the new economy, not having a better life than their kids did, which is part of the social contract in the United States, what they really feel is that they are not needed. The essence of dignity is being needed. Being needed in your community, being needed by your family, and most certainly being needed by the economy. So what is the opposite of dignity? And the answer is almost certainly despair. When people feel despair, as an historical matter in the United States, the result is political populism. So by logical process, populism, the topic that we're talking about here today, is linked to the sense of being needed. And this is a central point that James was making with his data. So what we need to talk about, if you join me in not liking political populism, we need to join together to create a society where everybody is more necessary, where everybody is more needed. That's the point that I want to make now. What is the origin of the problem today? The neededness crisis, not the populism crisis, the neededness crisis. I think that I can pinpoint a date. And this is a device, but bear with me. April 24th, 1964. That was the day that Lyndon Johnson went to Inez, Kentucky to kick off the war on poverty. Now, Lyndon Johnson, notwithstanding all of the success in public relations of all the modern presidents, the master of working the press was Lyndon Johnson. And kicking off the war on poverty, he went to this Appalachian town that had been racked by poverty for decades, that nobody knew about across America. And he went with a bunch of reporters from Time magazine and a bunch of photographers from Life magazine. He was a master. He got to Inez, Kentucky, and he went up on the porch of a random guy, a tar paper shack. The guy's name was Tom Fletcher. And they were snapping tons of pictures. You Google this, and you'll find pictures of LBJ, a great big guy down on his haunches, listening to this little wiry guy, Tom Fletcher. He said, "Tell me your story." And Tom Fletcher did. He told him a tale of desperation, real despair. He hadn't worked in years. He had 8 kids. He was 38 years old. He had a first-grade education. He was illiterate. His kids were malnourished, and he had no promise and no future and no hope. And Lyndon Johnson made sure all the reporters heard that, and he walked off the porch and he said that day, "Today I declare a war on poverty, and our goal is total victory." And you would have stood up and cheered. Maybe some of you did. Okay, so he gets back to Washington, and he puts a general in charge of his war on poverty, right? And the general's name is Sergeant Shriver. Now, I know a lot about Sergeant Shriver. Why? Because his son is my next-door neighbor in Bethesda, right? This is such an establishment Washington thing, right? And he was a great American. He loved this country. I mean, people disagree on economics, and some people are on the left, some people on the right, but he was a true patriot. And he was asked immediately, "What's your goal?" Here's what he said. 3 words: dignity, not doles. Every single one of you agrees with that. What happened? Because we have tons of doles and we have very little dignity. I've been back to Inez, Kentucky, and let me tell you what it looks like. 29% of the adults in Inez, Kentucky are in the workforce. 40% of the adults are on welfare. That's doles, and that's not dignity. We failed. By the way, we also spent $23 trillion in that war. Now, again, I don't begrudge that. I don't care about the money. And there's been tremendous gains in this. It's much, much more bearable to be poor. Fantastic. The greatest, in my view, the greatest achievement of the free enterprise system in America is our ability to create a welfare state where we can support our brothers and sisters that we don't even know. It's an incredible advance that's brought on by the free enterprise system. Wonderful. But when dignity is in decline, despair is ascendant, and when despair is descendant, the political knock-on effect will be populism. We have seen that accelerate over the past 30 years, and we've seen it inflect since the financial crisis of 2008. 2 great economists, both teach at Princeton University, Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton is the 2015 Nobel laureate in economics, wrote a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences to look at places like Inez, Kentucky. It was a demographic paper, and they asked a very simple question. What's happening to life expectancy in America? And it's mostly great news. Over the past 100 years, every demographic group has been living longer with better health and better quality of life, except one. One group since 1999 has started to die younger. They are men, white men, 45 to 54, without a college education. My friends, that's Inez, Kentucky. Inez, Kentucky, which went 80% Republican in the 2016 presidential election. Oh, by the way, why are they dying younger? 3 reasons. A 46% increase since 1999 in cirrhosis of the liver, a 78% increase in suicide, and a 323% increase in drug overdose deaths. These are men my age who look like me, who are drinking themselves to death and killing themselves and dying of drug overdoses. That, my friends, is the economy of despair. What is dignity in the face of that? It's jobs, it's work, it's an economy that needs them. So I leave you with this. If you don't like populism, don't take on populism per se. Don't take on politics per se. Judge every policy by this standard. Does it make more people needed or fewer people needed? Now, liberals and conservatives are going to disagree. Democrats and Republicans are going to disagree on what makes people needed. Bring on that debate. Because until we have a debate about neededness, we will not be talking about dignity. We will not be dealing with despair, and as such, we will have no idea what to do when we see populism. Thank you.
Try word. Oops.
Danielle. Hello, everyone. I'm Derek Thompson. I'm a staff writer for The Atlantic. This is Danielle Allen. She is a populist expert from Harvard University.
Actually, I've never been called that before.
Well,
many things
first time
I've
for
been
everything.
called, but exactly.
My first question is, this is an event, a deep dive on populism. I'm not entirely sure I understand what populism is. And I also am not entirely sure I understand why populism is bad. From like an etymology standpoint, it seems like populism means people. It should be good. So when we talk about populism, what are we talking about? And why do we think it's dangerous?
I think that's a hugely important question because we have all been using this word freely, frequently, loosely, and I think it is good to bear down on it. One has to make a few distinctions. Let's start with the concept of popular sovereignty, okay? So this is a concept, popular sovereignty, that is the reason we're all sitting in this room together. It's the basis for democracy, the notion that we, the people, can build political institutions that secure rights and deliver safety and happiness for all of us, all right? Instead of having George III, the sovereign, you have we, the people, the sovereign, okay? So the people is good in that sense as the basis for democracy. So what exactly is populism against that backdrop? In effect, you have to have in your mind a distinction between liberal democracy and electoral democracy. Liberal democracy is democracy that focuses on that institutional structure I just pointed to, which is about securing rights. And that is about protecting the rights of minorities as well as protecting the majority and the rights of the majority, all right? And the reasons we have a highly rights-oriented democracy are long and complicated. They relate to the wars of religion in the early modern period and the emergence of a discourse of toleration and things like that. But it's this key idea that you're recognizing the power of the majority, protecting the power of the majority, but balancing that with protections for the minority, minorities of all kinds. All right, so populism starts to sweep away that interest in protecting minorities as part of a democratic system. It's really focused on the power of the majority, and from it you get what people call electoral democracy, which is really the connection of the people to a powerful executive. And you sort of knocked out the other institutions, legislatures, judiciaries, and so forth. Those become less important. So that's the contrast that's important to keep in mind. And I want to say one last thing about that. Because when I talk about the rights of minorities, I think many people will begin by thinking about civil rights and so forth. But actually, the elite, the wealth elite, the professional elite, the Washington establishment, is a minority. Okay? Actually, in this country, people who get their news by reading are now a minority. Okay? So all of those minorities are also protected by a concept of liberal democracy. Populism wants to sweep that aside and say, let the majority clearly decide what happens, and let's not worry about the kinds of protections or even knowledge bases that we get from one of these varying minority perspectives.
Thank you so much for that definition. Now that we have the what, I want to talk about the where. We had a couple countries named earlier. We know this is happening in the US. With Brexit, it's happening in the UK, in France, in Germany, potentially in Austria. Before we talk about how these movements might be subtly different, what are the similarities that we're seeing in all of these countries that are having so-called populist revolutions?
So I think there are a few different things to pay attention to, and one is the point that James made to start, which is to say, across the developed world, we have been in a low-growth economic period. And in addition to having low growth, we've also had this highly unequal distribution of the results of growth. So the increases in income inequality affect developed countries broadly. It is more extreme in the US than some cases, and there's lots you could talk about on that front, but that is a part of the picture. That's absolutely correct. But there's another interesting part of the picture which also goes to the point of, why does Australia look different and feel different and so forth? Why does Canada look different and feel different? And that actually goes back to this distinction I was making between liberal democracy and electoral democracy. So the wave of revolutions from the late 18th century and early 19th century brought the world a bunch of liberal democracies. The US, Britain began to liberalize its constitutional monarchy, France, the European countries, and so forth. They did not achieve full egalitarian structures. We know about slavery, we know later about segregation, et cetera. Nonetheless, liberal democracies. The wave of democratization that came in the 20th century that followed the end of colonialism and so forth was much more likely to generate electoral democracy, okay, the sort of very majoritarian-oriented democratic forms. And similarly, actually, in the wake of the Soviet Union and in our current piece of post-Arab Spring and so forth, the orientation has been much more towards electoral democracy than liberal democracy. And so actually that Anglo, specifically English, a tradition of rights protections is the thing that sort of sets one kind of popular government apart from another kind. And so the question of where it's under strain is a part of what's at issue here. I think, why are we better off than, say, Turkey, for instance, or Venezuela? In part, it's because our liberal democratic institutions do have resilience in them. So yes, we're facing a populist moment, but the fact of the matter is we've got resilience here for protecting and operating liberal democratic institutions that are different from some of the countries where populism is already a much stronger phenomenon.
That's so interesting. I just want to drill down on that because you said something that I want to make sure I understand. You said that there's something about the English tradition of liberal democracy that might be a bulwark against populism. That might be an inarticulate sort of summary. But it's interesting because if you think about like the Commonwealth and former countries that have sort of spun off from the former English Empire, you actually have a very clear schism. You have the UK with Brexit and the US with Trump that clearly have populist revolutions, but then you also have Canada and Australia that do not. So is there some other ingredient in here that might explain why some countries right now are experiencing populist revolutions while others aren't?
So I think it's a little harder to explain why Canada and Australia are more stable than it is to explain why there's so much populism in the world. The economic question has such a huge part to play on the latter front. But to come to Australia and Canada, there are a few key institutional differences that may be part of what matters here. So Australia, for example, has had mandatory voting since the 1920s, okay? Now, what does that mean? What that means is that you actually never lose the majoritarian voice from politics. So in this country, as our voting rates have declined, we've actually ceased to have a really good way of registering the full spread of opinion in the country. And consequently, I would argue, elite policymakers have been able to be less attentive to, less understanding of the perspectives and needs that a majority of, say, working class Americans are experiencing. I think Australia avoids that because of mandatory voting. The Canadian context is, I think, a different case altogether. So one of the things that's happened is you have the economic problems and difficulties, and there's a lot to be said about what we heard from James and Arthur. There are a few things I would, in fact, beg to differ with a little
We'll
bit.
get to that.
But at any rate, so what we saw in 2016 was one candidate, President Trump, who came along and said, I've got a diagnosis for you. I know you're suffering, the cause of your suffering, globalization, Chinese behavior in the world of trade, and immigration, right? And hammering on the immigration piece. Canada has a very different immigration regime than we do, and it has strong national consensus around immigration. So that particular sort of line of attack, that sort of line that tends to open up a populist point of view, isn't so available in Canada. So I think that must be part of the story as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. And the Australian piece, I think, is particularly important. I'd love you to reconcile a debate that's going on in this country and has been going on since the beginning of the Trump campaign, which was essentially, to boil it down, whether the Trump phenomenon is about economic anxiety or cultural anxiety. That is this about automation and outsourcing, globalization, stagnating wages, or is it really not about any of that? Is it about racism and fear of demographic change? The or in the middle there can be a little misleading because, of course, there can be contributing factors from both these buckets. But how do you allocate your sort of percentages to each?
Terrific. No, so I will absolutely give you a both-and answer. That will not be a surprise to anybody. But I want to put the both-and answer in some context. And this is where I actually want to engage with some of the things that Arthur said when he was drawing on the data from Agnes Deaton and Ann Case. He's exactly right that there's been this extraordinary phenomenon of decline in life expectancy for working-class white men, white women, working-class white women too, as I understand it. But the interesting thing about that is not just that there's been that decline, but that if you take the category of working-class African-American men and women, working-class Latino men and women, they have seen some improvement. Their life expectancy is still worse than working-class whites, but what you're actually seeing is a convergence, okay? For me, the most important graph in all of their data is the one that has the whole working class, and what you see is life expectancy shrinking. It's an upward curve. It's a little complicated to explain, but for the white working class and coming, the rates of death coming down slightly for the person of color working class, but really what you're seeing is a story of convergence. That's the key point, okay? In other words, we have a habit of sometimes talking about race and sometimes talking about class and trying to figure out how to go back and forth between those. But the underlying phenomenon that we're experiencing is a convergence of working class experience regardless of color, okay? And that destabilizes what has been a long-lived American tradition of splitting the working class through racist language, okay? So that is to say, there is a combined interest around issues of economic opportunity, jobs. I agree about the need for work and dignity, absolutely. A production economy that thinks about how you pull different parts of our society into the workforce, et cetera. There's convergent interests across racial lines there, but this country has a very long history of drawing on racial rhetoric to make that hard to see, all right? So yes, I mean, we have a lot of political discourse which is pushing on the economic problems. Those economic problems are cross-racial, but then our solutions to them fall back on some of our old habits of racialized thinking. And that's what we really need to get out of that mindset.
I'd love you to talk about a little bit more about this question of economics versus culture, because I found myself really sucked into the story of 1964 and Case Deaton and Kentucky. And at the same time, there are two statistics that, to me, complicate that story. One statistic is that in the 2016 election, Trump voters had a higher than average income, according to some research, which suggests that it might not be a purely economic story. It might be a story where the inputs are about culture. Another factor, because I'm really happy that we're talking about this as a global trend, there was a New York Review of Books essay about the populist phenomenon in Germany, and I just pulled out this amazing stat. 4/5 of AfD, sort of populist German voters, 4/5 of this populist movement say their personal economic situation is either good or very good, which suggests the populist movement, at least in Germany, is cultural with a K. And I'd love you just to talk a little bit more about, the word is, the word culture is spelled with a K in German. It wasn't a cult or other reference. So I would love you just to talk a little bit more about how you see race, fear, demographic change being an engine of the populist movement.
So this is a very important and hard subject. So let's just go ahead and say that first. So in that data about Trump voters, there are a few other things that come out. So it is, to some degree, better off incomes. I would say sort of upper middle class. It's not the wealth elite, right? And it is also older voters. So although in James's data, it's the young who were hammered by 2008, that actually is not sort of where the Trump voting base fell. That said, as I understand the survey research, those same voters poll high with answering the question, do you think your kids will be better off than you, by saying no. So their view of the prospects for their children has dimmed, even if they themselves
So their level of income might be higher than average, but their perspective of the rate of growth of their family's income is negative.
That's right, and the opportunity for their children specifically. And this is where we do get into issues of race. And the reason for, I think this is, there are a lot of pieces of this. So one is that as people survey a landscape and see lower opportunity for younger generations, okay? One thing that we commonly understand is that globalization has had a lot to do with that, and it has. And there are economists who would argue that our economy is converging with economies in the developing world, okay, which is a very different than kind of opportunity structure that we look out at for rising generations, okay? So we can see that change. That global elite that supported the globalizing policies tended, in arguing for them, also to connect their arguments to very strong pluralist, cosmopolitan, pro-immigration arguments. And so to some extent, I think the kind of concern about what globalization has done to opportunity for future generations, it has been tethered to, therefore, a critique of the pluralist, cosmopolitan view. That is, the policymaking elite tethered these things together. We get worried about globalization. Therefore, we should also be worried about the other piece that was connected to it. That's how I see the dynamic working in part. It's not the whole story, but I do think it's part of it.
Okay, so now that we sort of diagnosed the problem, that there's this sort of nauseous stew of lingering racial resentment, outright racism that's converged with the working class phenomenon that you've described and globalization, how are these problems fixable? How can we go forward? What can somebody do to re-liberalize American democracy?
Okay, well.
You have 3 minutes, by the way.
Exactly, yes. And there are a lot of people in this room who know a lot more about that than I do, but nonetheless. So yes, I think that we need to rethink questions of political economy at a fundamental level. And from my point of view, that means, so we have been spending a lot of time thinking about our economy under a redistributive lens. That is, we accept the fact that there's going to be this incredible growth that comes from globalization, where that growth really accrues to the top 1%. But no problem, because we're going to redistribute to everybody else. All right, but that triggers the dignity problem, for one thing. And in various other ways, it hollows out the empowerment of the rest of the population. Okay, that's connected to the dignity concept. So it's time, I think, to think a little bit more about, again, the production part of political economy. How do you ensure that as production is organized, what it generates is already more egalitarian in its distribution? So you're not having to rely in the first instance on thinking about redistribution post a really unequal result from the economy.
Give me one policy idea that could go to that end.
So, there's the things that people talk about as industrial policy, right? Sort of rethinking the structure of the industrial infrastructure of the country. It does also relate to issues of housing and transportation and the way in which economic opportunity is connected to issues of mobility. Are people where the jobs are, and vice versa? And if not, how do you get them there? The housing crisis is a huge part of that question of whether or not people can be worked into the productive economy in ways that the benefits flow directly to them. So again, there are people in this room who are far greater experts on the answer piece than I am. So I think the conversation should take that away.
All right, well, that's all we have time for. I will go on calling you a populist expert. Thank you, Danielle.
Okay, this is the good part. This is where we get to the answers of this difficult conundrum. But before we do that, we have 3 people on stage, and I can't let the opportunity pass to kind of get your views on how we got to here. Jason, you were a very prominent member of the Obama administration working on these very economic issues. Where do you stand in the economic versus cultural question here?
Right. So Danielle reluctantly answered the solutions, and I'll reluctantly answer the causes question. And start with a bias. The issues I work on, I like to think they're the cause of everything and the most important thing in the world. And the solutions I'm in favor of, I like to think they solve every problem. When you look at the data, I'm actually a little bit less sure of both of those propositions. And I think it's important not just to look at 2016, because that was a weird year, a weird election, but to try to look a little bit more across countries and across time. If you look across time, at the end of World War II, voting was by class, especially in Europe. In the United States, a bit less because of race scrambled that up, but working people voted for the Labor Party, wealthier people voted for the Tory Party. Almost continual from the 1945 to the present decline in class-based voting and scrambling up. Similarly, if you do polls of the salience of economic issues versus the salience of non-economic issues, for about 60 straight years, the salience of economic issues have gone down for voters, and the salience of non-economic issues have gone up for voters. So that's sort of the first bit of long context for me.
Non-economic issues like immigration?
And I'm going to get to immigration. So then the second thing is let's look across countries. And you see some of the most virulent populism in places like Poland and Hungary that have had very good economies and very low unemployment rates. And as we heard, there's some places with very similar economic performance that haven't. So I think one thing is less class-based voting. Another is salience of non-economic issues. Now, what are those issues and why would they get triggered now? I think immigration is a huge one. In 1970, 5% of the nation of immigrants were actually immigrants. 5% of the United States were immigrants. Now it's up to 13%. That's tied with the highest in our history since the first people came off the boat, probably higher than that. So there's been a large change. Canada and Australia have actually had a smaller increase in immigration than we've had. And places like Sweden, Germany, and France that have virulent populist movements that have not been successful to date have had even larger. So I think that's a big part of it. I think that's consistent with some of the voting evidence that statements about economic anxiety tend to be less correlated with voting. Statements of animus towards immigrants, towards minorities, are very highly correlated with voting for populist parties. So I'm not sure how much of the problem is economics. And then I'll just super quickly say, I'm going to give you a ton of economic solutions. If you adopt all of them, incomes will be 4.7% higher after 10 years. The labor force participation rate will be 3.2 percentage points higher. That will be phenomenal economic performance. It's hard for me to imagine it would radically change our politics.
Kevin, you're a fellow member of the media and launched Quartz, which is a mobile-first news product, and really have tapped into young readers, voters, and people around the country and the world. What's your view of populism?
And the view of it? I think one thing that I would add to this discussion is that the assumption that we're making here is that the populist instinct is all on the right. And I think that there is an anti-establishment instinct that is also coming from the left. And in some places, they're unifying. So anti-establishment on the left, mobilizes around things like trade, against globalization, and things like that. And they sort of come together in some points, but you have groups of people who are expressing similar distrust of institutions, which is, I think, at the root of a lot of the populist phenomenon, who are coming at it from very different places. And so I would add to this discussion that it's hard to have a single actual solution, given where people are starting.
Mm-hmm. Chad, how much does this have to do with globalization? And I want to talk about trade and tariffs in a moment, but this feeling that globalization has not lifted all boats equally, and that around the world, the distribution of economic wealth has really warped?
So I think the perception is that it has a lot to do with globalization. That's certainly in the United States case in the 2016 election, whether it was Mexico or China or immigrants, it was pitted as all about foreigners. And I think you can see some of this happening a little bit in the UK as well, in their movement, blaming everything on Brussels and the European Union. My job, I'm not actually an expert at all about populism. What I tend to focus on is on international institutions and trying to understand these things. My current job for the last 2 years has basically been to try to explain to the public what things like the World Trade Organization and NAFTA and trade agreements and the benefits of these things and what they actually are. And so I would, having gone through that experience, I spent a lot of my time now working with media, a lot of young journalists that don't necessarily know a lot about these things, is to just try to explain. I think that's part of the problem, is we as society have taken these institutions as given for a long time, and now you have a populist president in the United States who finds it very convenient to blame both foreigners and these nameless, faceless institutions out there. And then you wonder how much of this is true. I don't know anything about what the WTO is, so I think part of this is on us as well. We just haven't done a good job of motivating, understanding, educating about what the value of these important institutions are that are kind of just as important as the federal government or how we organize our domestic politics in the United States.
So I want to talk a bit about solutions and where we go from here. If we could just go around, and James, maybe we could start with you, and feel free to interject, any of you. If you had one or two things that you think would actually have a demonstrable impact, what would those be?
One of the things that's happened in the last 20 years or so in most advanced economies is the fact that we've actually stopped investing in human capital. And you can see this a couple different ways. So we've actually done some work, and others have done this too. If you look at by two measures, one which is how much does each economy, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector, spend on on-the-job training. First of all, the United States spends the least. Secondly, most advanced economies, especially the ones where we've seen these waves of populism, have actually been spending even less. So there's we're going in reverse at a time when we all say skills and capabilities are important. You also see as a similar measure, if you look at the kind of assistance we often give to people who've been dislocated, whether it's by technology or globalization or whatever have you, the levels of assistance for that is actually very, very low. Again, the United States is at the bottom of the list for most advanced economies for how much you support that. So if you take all that together, I think we have to do something that focuses on how do we reinvest again in people.
So you would be in favor, China is spending $6 billion on AI, investing in AI versus saving coal plants.
Well, no. I've been in favor of finding ways to encourage and incent this system, whether it's a private sector, public sector, to do much better job of investing in people. For example, we've encouraged, for example, private corporations and created all kinds of incentives to encourage them to invest in capital, or R&D, but we don't do quite as much to the same extent and encourage them to invest in people. Mm-hmm. Not quite as much. We do a little bit, but not a whole lot. Mm-hmm. So I think I'd find a way to do more of that.
Arthur, you agree?
So my job on this panel is following up on James. And he's exactly right. Look, if we're worried about populism, we're basically worried about very low economic growth in the bottom 4/5 of the economy as a general matter, which typically we see very low growth in the bottom 4/5 of the economy in the aftermath of a financial markets crisis. I mean, Jason is a real expert on this. But we know this, and we
Thank you for not blaming President Obama for all of it.
Indeed. No. I mean, that's, one of the things I often tell conservative audiences, which I don't count this group, is that Milton Friedman could have been president of the United States after 2008. We would have had flat growth, particularly in the bottom 4/5 of the economy. It's a hypothesis. But still, so the key thing is, what do you do to increase economic growth in the bottom 80%? Now, recall that virtually all of the economic growth over the past 10 years has been in the top 20% of the income distribution. And so presidents and politicians will talk about how great economic growth is in the stock market. 85% of equity returns in the stock market have gone to the top 10% of the income distribution. We just have to recognize these things. So the policies have to be more growth, particularly in the bottom 3 quintiles of the economy. So James is right. If you want a long-term, look, there are short-term solutions about tax reform and industrial incentives for more companies to come to the United States, et cetera. But the long-term approach, such that we're not back here having the same conversation 10 and 15 years from now, although I'd love to see you, I'd like to talk about something else besides populism. And so 10 and 15 years from now, what we need is a workforce that has more skills in the bottom 80%. The biggest crisis that we have, we've been wasting time in the whole education reform debate, not because K-12 and charters and choice and all that stuff is not important, but because we have not talked about skills and workforce development adequately. That is the education reform debate of our time. Why is it? It's not just a question of shop class. Why is it that we've had a college for all mentality in this country, which is incredibly classist and really deleterious to the advancement of our society, where practically speaking, 70% of Americans are not going to have a college degree. We've relatively neglected them. What are we doing about apprenticeships in this country? What are we doing about vocational and technical education at the community college level? These are the questions where we can dig in and where we can have national and especially state and local policy that could put teeth into the things that James is saying, where I believe that in 10 years from now, it will have implications that are quite profound in our political debates.
Mm-hmm. So Jason, of your list of economic policies, if we adopt them all, what's at the top?
Of my 4.7, I'm only going to do 3.2 for you today. Notwithstanding my previously nihilistic comments, I think we should be doing everything we can to promote growth. And I think in particular, Arthur is really right. He speaks much better than I do. I use words like labor force participation rate. The percentage of people who are in the workforce, in jobs, or looking for jobs. I think that's really, really important, above and beyond just inequality, how fast your income's going. Are you included in society? Are you, as Arthur said, needed? So I think making that a top economic priority, I think, is really important. But let me give you 3 ideas, and Arthur and James saved me time because I agreed with all of theirs. Number 1, the biggest thing we can do for economic growth rate is paradoxically something I think may be causing us a lot of the political problems that we have associated with our growth rate, and that's immigration. Without immigration, our workforce would be falling over the next decade. With it, it would be rising. That matters because it's not just that the extra people are extra workers, but they're workers at a time when you have a lot of retirees. That's important. But they're also immigrants are more likely to start businesses, more likely to innovate, more likely to add actually to our productivity growth, which raises our per capita income, raises wages of people here in America. I think that is the single biggest dial we have economically to help our outlook. The second is about mobility, and I think that's absolutely critical. And basically, economics has studied this a lot recently. I think just about anything for children works really well for mobility. One of the big advances in economics is using large data sets that are administrative data to track people over long periods of time, 30, 40, 50 years. And what we're discovering is if you're in a family that as a child got Medicaid, got food stamps, got welfare, got the EITC, got preschool, got housing vouchers, that you look at that child 30 years later, they're more likely to be working, they have higher earnings, they are less likely to be in jail, they're more likely to have better health. And those are careful causal estimates. We sort of look at 2 children in similar families where one of them accidentally got it, like the treatment group, the other was the placebo group. So I think just about anything for children, preschool would be at the top of that list, but any of those would be. And then the last thing is I don't think even with all the skills in the world, the economy is necessarily going to generate the returns that we would like for workers with less skill. And so I think we have to make up some of the difference. The earned income tax credit is one way to do that. You only get that if you're working. There's other ways you could do that with wage supplements. We could talk more about the details, but I think something like that is a way of saying, we're going to make sure that work is rewarded, that you have more of an incentive to work.
Kevin, we've spent a remarkably long amount of time before the words artificial intelligence have been raised. What are your thoughts as someone who's really in the middle of the tech revolution?
Yeah, and I think James is really the expert on how this is going to affect our labor force. But the fact is that this is a dislocation that is coming that we're not necessarily getting in front of. And one, to sort of tie to the question you're just asking, I think a big issue that we've got to get our heads around is higher education and training. And the manifestation of the issues with higher education is the amount of debt that young people come out of college with. This is a burden that prevents them from following the opportunities that might be more rewarding or might be, and in many cases actually increasingly and troublingly, it prevents them from even deciding to go to college to begin with because it's so intimidating. I'm not saying that four-year college for $70,000 a year is what everyone should be doing or is the answer to this, but it's part of a system around job training and around higher education that clearly needs engagement at a national level. And if we fix that, I think that some of these questions of mobility and economic opportunity become a little bit clearer.
Could I just jump in on the AI question, just because you brought it up, Rebecca? One of the things that's exciting at the moment is, and will be for the future, is all the progress we're making in artificial intelligence and automation systems and so forth. This is a wonderful thing. And in fact, the answer there is we actually want more of it rather than less. Partly because the contributions that AI and automation systems make to economic growth and productivity is phenomenal. So if we care about economic growth and we care about productivity growth, we want to actually embrace these technologies even more than we are. So we actually need more of it rather than less. But here's the conundrum. So even as we need it for economic growth, business performance, and all those reasons, we need to be thoughtful about the implications for work. And that's the other side of it. And we already know that even though there'll be enough work for everybody, many of us who've looked at these things believe that, it may have effects on incomes and wages. Because one of the things that looks like it could happen is that, and we've already seen versions of it even already, which is many of the tasks and activities that are easily automatable have tended to be things that have been done by middle income groups. So a lot of things like analytical work, collecting data, analyzing data, working in a factory, working in a physical environment where you can set it up however you want. Those tend to be the things that are actually relatively easy to automate. But a lot of the middle income wages have actually been mostly in that group. So the occupational mix shifts that we're likely to
So this could get worse, in other words.
could actually potentially, because a lot of the things that are hard for machines to do, by the way, tend to be things that require empathy, judgment, and so forth. They look like care work and so forth. A lot of those things are things that we've historically not paid huge wages for. Think about care work. Think about teachers. We never pay teachers as well as we need to. And those are typically hard things for machines to do. So I think we're going to need to be thoughtful about how do we think about the wage implications, even as we should, and I would encourage, embrace even more of these AI and automation technologies for economic growth purposes.
Chad, what's a single thing that you think would help as you look around the world?
Like, what exactly should the tariffs on steel be?
We're going to get to tariffs in a second. We're going to.
Sorry. I'm having a hard time holding myself back from talking about tariffs.
You can talk about tariffs.
Because honestly, my entire life now is talking all about the policies that we shouldn't do. I think that's part of the problem where we are today, at least in the United States, is we're not talking really about addressing these concerns about adjustment and what the future of work is going to look like, the displaced workers 10 years from now, if it's truck drivers or what have you. We are talking about problems of 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So yeah, can I just say one thing about tariffs? Just once, and then we'll go on.
Let's go there.
Okay.
What do you think about the Trump administration's trade war? Do you think it's going to help workers?
No, I think it's we could do 3 hours on this, but I'll do it in 2 minutes. So I think the Harley-Davidson example from Monday kind of shed a lot of light on the problems with going down this path. So obviously Harley-Davidson, an iconic, American product, but not only in the United States, but around the world. People around the world want to buy these motorcycles and drive them around and feel like, they're in the Wild West or something like that. Harley-Davidson now is finding it really, really difficult to produce motorcycles in the United States and to sell them in other countries around the world. One reason why is because they need to use things like steel and aluminum to be able to make them. Steel and aluminum are now a lot more expensive because President Trump has decided to shut off the steel and aluminum imports from the rest of the world, mostly our friends and allies, the Canadians, the Europeans. So the input costs of these things are higher. Our friends, because now they're getting hit with American tariffs, have said, well, if you're going to do that to us, we're kind of going to have to do the same thing back to you. So the Europeans have imposed tariffs and said, if you want to sell Harley-Davidson motorcycles here in Europe, you're now going to have to pay 25% more to be able to do so. And Harley said, we can't afford to do that. So we need to produce elsewhere in other countries around the world where they have plants, whether it's in Brazil or just to be able to compete, to sell to the 7 billion customers that are out there, that are not in the United States. So no, I think that the Trump administration's policies are unfortunately self-defeating. And I imagine there are a lot of Trump voters that work for Harley-Davidson that might have supported his policies in general, but are now finding themselves in kind of a bad spot because of that.
Does anyone disagree? Arthur, James, isn't it time to, particularly in the case with China, for the U.S. to take some sort of stand about the trade imbalance, which is kind of at the heart of where this started?
Can I say something? Or, if you want to.
Go ahead, Jason.
People underestimate just how much China has changed in the last decade. 2006, they had a current account surplus of 10% of GDP. That's basically the trade surplus plus some financial flows. Now, does anyone know what it is? 1.4% of GDP. They went from 10 to 1.4. It's one of the most phenomenal reductions in a trade surplus that we've seen of any country in the post-war period. Why did they do that? One reason was their currency, which was artificially undervalued and taking advantage of the rest of the world, appreciated by 40%. Another reason is that they've shifted towards doing a lot more domestic consumption than they used to be. And their imports, since they entered the WTO, are up like 880% or something like that. So first of all, I think on China it is important to have a little bit of the big picture, that some of the biggest problems we had with them, we've actually made a lot more progress than we want to talk about. There are remaining issues that are, I think, quite important on issues like intellectual property, the disparate treatment of investment in China, some of their subsidies. I think those are perfectly legitimate issues. I actually don't think they're the hugest issues for the United States. I think in some of those cases, China's doing some stupid things and they're going to waste some money, and we should just, insofar as we want other countries to be poor, which is not what we should want, we could just stand by and watch. I think in the best case, if we had a well-coordinated strategy with our allies, not fighting a war with them, but all together on China on these abuses, doing it in a multilateral way, doing it through WTO, that'd be good for our economy. I think it'd be good for the global economy. But I think the goodness would be about this much. And so I think we're risking a downside that's pretty large in order to get an upside that isn't really, that's a positive number, but not huge.
Kevin, we talked before about the symbolism that sometimes is an important part of populism. And, certainly the coal plants and saving the coal plants and the manufacturing jobs has been a big part of President Trump's agenda here. What's behind, do you see that in other places? And, does it seem to you to be misguided in a sense? I think, Jason, you just said saving jobs from 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think, what we've been talking about is this sort of fundamental and economic foundation for this phenomenon of populism. I think how it manifests itself both culturally and politically is in symbols. So there's the symbol of the coal plant. There's a symbol of the wall with Mexico. And what's clear is that a very well-reasoned economic argument about why we shouldn't pick a war with China isn't winning the hearts and minds of the populists. And so I would argue that one of the biggest challenges that that anyone, the answer moving forward from this is to not only solve the fundamental problems, but actually engage with the symbols in a way that respects the feelings of the people who have those symbols. Just on symbols, one of the reasons that the image of the girl crying, who we thought was separated from her mother, was so powerful. It was that it was this counter symbol to the symbol of the wall and the immigrant rapists and the other symbols that have been deployed. And it's among the reasons that the debunking of that had such political impact was because it was a counter symbol. So I don't know the answer to this, but do know that the reality is that a lot of the discussion is taking place on that level and not on the level that we're engaged in here about the macroeconomics.
Arthur, you talked about Kentucky and the town in Kentucky. How do you feel about the importance of restoring manufacturing jobs in the U.S.?
Well, let me play just for a second off of something that Jason said earlier, which was sort of in jest. He said that if we do all the best economic policies, which we've been talking about sort of ad nauseum for the past 45 minutes, you get like 4.7% improvement. Now, it's easy for us to be nihilistic about it because we're a bunch of policy wonks. I run a think tank in Washington, and so this is what we talk about all day. So we talk about it around the lunch table, right? But Kevin is starting to take us down a path. I think it's really more important, actually. When I was finishing my PhD, a guy who was sitting in on my doctoral dissertation defense wound up being the great mentor of my life, a man named James Q. Wilson. And he, when I was an assistant professor, he would review my work, and he wrote the foreword to my first book, and he sat on the board of AEI. Really great man, maybe the greatest political scientist of the past 75 years. And when I was, right after my doctoral dissertation defense, which went very poorly, by the way, he said, I want you to know something. I want you to remember something. He said, the policies that you're now becoming an expert in affect people at no more than the 5% extrinsic margin of their lives. That's what Jason was saying too. And I said, oh my God, I just got a PhD in this. Now you tell me, man. I said, what's the other 95%? And he said, mostly love. So this is ultimately what we're talking about in a country that's racked by a political phenomenon that we now label as populism. We're being told continuously that people who disagree with us, people in our country who disagree with us, are stupid and evil. You read about it from your favorite columnist in the paper I write for. I hope not me. We are seeing this from our politicians, and I don't care if you're on the left or the right, you're seeing this over and over and over again. And this is not a civility problem. This is not a discourse problem. My friends, this is a love problem. This is compassion, and this is empathy. And until each one of us, I don't care what your politics are, can actually say, I am going to listen to people I disagree with an open mind and an open heart. We're going to be manipulated, and a lot of people, millions of people are going to be manipulated. So let me leave you with this thought. This is a great ideas festival. I just love this. And by the way, I'm giving away all my best lines. I'm going to talk on happiness at 4:20, and I'm going to talk about love, right? So I'm getting warmed up, man. And this is, what are we going to do when we leave the Aspen Ideas Festival to show more brotherhood and more solidarity? Because that's our weapon against the things that we don't like, the currents that we don't like in this country. It's really up to us.
I'd love to open it up to questions. There's one, I think they're right there. And then in the middle.
So, how many Mexicans are there here? Can you stand up? Mexicans? Yeah? Okay.
Mexicans.
So this Sunday we have our biggest election in history. And I'm shocked that no one is talking about Mexico. We have two candidates that are overwhelmingly showing populist tendencies. Not even towards the left or the right, it's completely undefined. So I really want to hear Mexico is your third most important trade partner. We're the 15th this year, largest economy. like in the world. What are your thoughts on Mexico? What is going to mean? We're going to renegotiate NAFTA soon. Hell, we have to organize the World Cup in 8 years. So, like, what is going on in your minds with regards to with the border, with your neighbor down south, with us?
Do any of you want to take that? Shed? I mean, you work a lot on NAFTA, and certainly Mexico is.
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in Mexican politics, unfortunately. But it obviously has actually played seemingly a huge role in this whole trade policy discussion in strategy, even of the Trump administration, where they have, the president kind of pulled back a bit from his arguable, quite mistreatment of Mexico, out of recognition that this election was so important. So, it permeates, I think, everything. I don't honestly know how it's ultimately going to play out. Trying to now match this with Trump and trade policy negotiation makes my mind spin. All I want to do is love, so I'm finding it challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
I just think, Mexico's a good example of the fact that other countries have politics too. And if you're going to redefine the world as, instead of a positive-sum rule-based place, a zero-sum sort of lawless nationalistic place, there's I think a certain contagion to it. And then I'm sure there's all sorts of things going on inside Mexico that are playing a role as well.
To be fair, this panel is focused mostly on America. So but obviously, it's hugely important, and the whole immigration debate is very much, the border with Mexico is a huge issue in this country now. But that's not really the topic of the discussion. Another question.
My name is Ken Field, and we had a wonderful session about China and Russia, and there was an awful lot said there about the fact that China especially is not playing fair with us. And I do perhaps disagree with the comment you made about 1%, we're almost even on GDP with China, because I think there's a lot of information that argues with that. But my question really is this. We all want the tariffs to go away. I don't think anybody is really interested in the tariffs. What we want to do is get China to play fair. And I think the other countries too, and I'm a Canadian, all right, in terms of what should be good for the United States. So my question is this. We're Americans here. I feel like an American too. We're Americans here. And what can we do as citizens? Because, if our country stood up as citizens, and as people who are in this room who have companies that are buying things, let's say, from China, and for 1 month or 2 months, we gave them a message that we don't like what they're doing. Stop buying Chinese products for a little while. Wait until you see how fast they change. That's my question. Do you think it's right?
I'll just be very brief. First of all, I'm giving economic advice here. I completely agree with Kevin. If somebody asked me to do a poll and tell them how to run for president, probably being extremely tough on China would be a great thing to do, even if that's going to raise our GDP by 1/10 of 1% in the good case, and be a big minus if we screw up the execution. But that is certainly what I would recommend to any politician from a political perspective that they do. Not sure if we need to be so tough on Canada and their trade policies, but that I'll leave to the real experts. In answer to your question, I think the thing we have to understand is China breaks a lot of rules. To get to that sentence, you have rules in that sentence. They actually have agreements they abided by. When we bring WTO cases against them, we win. They follow those cases. We can bring those cases together with other countries, focus on them, focus on the issues that matter with them. I think if that were well executed, I'd be supportive of that. If that was imperfectly executed, which seems to be what this administration is doing, it's not worth the risk.
Chad, isn't it a bit too late to totally boycott Chinese goods? I mean, a lot of American manufacturers use Chinese products. Apple makes all of its iPhones in China. It's a pretty interconnected global economy.
It is, and you know, I have a colleague that put together the data on this. The tariffs that the Trump administration is imposing on China, it's something like 60 to 70% of them are actually coming in being made by American companies, Japanese companies, you know, European companies that are assembled in China but sold to the United States. So this is ultimately hurting ourselves. But I just want to also reiterate Jason's point. The main thing that the Trump administration is doing is giving up on the rule of law. And there are laws that we can try to get China to work better under. But that's not really what the Trump administration's approach is. It would be, you know, working with allies, the Canadians, the Europeans, all together on this. They seem to be heading us toward a world of lawlessness. And there, I'm not sure we can engage effectively with a country like China that may be more effective in that sort of lawlessness world than we are.
Question right here, down here.
Yeah, we're one of the 3 or 4 Mexicans here in the room. And we're actually very happy to be here. The point I wanted to make is that, yeah, populism, you were talking mostly from the right. We're having an existential problem in Mexico this Sunday from a populist from the left. Mm-hmm. And the reason why this guy has risen in the polls is precisely because, well, Arthur was mentioning about the lack of dignity. In Mexico, we have existentialism for 40 years, and it hasn't worked. So the same problems that you're having here from the right, we're having them from the left. The same thing, anti-globalization that you have here, we have it there. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of things in common, not only the border.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a very good point. Kevin, you made that point earlier, and you're seeing that in Europe as well.
Yeah, and I think what I was thinking is you could argue, you know, Bernie Sanders was not a populist candidate under the definition of strictly of populism, but he definitely appealed to, from the left, he appealed to very criticism of institutions, particularly financial institutions and Wall Street. And it's a different manifestation than you're talking about, but it's also an example of how it's easy for us to forget about it here, but it is actually, there is a movement there that's not probably necessarily, doesn't have a leader at the forefront right at the moment, but there are people who would be mobilized.
Yeah, no, I was going to add to that. One of the things that's interesting in these surveys, where you look across countries that have had these the kind of economic data on incomes that I was describing, the full set of surveys were interesting. So if you look across the surveys, of course, each country that has seen these waves of income stagnation has its own particular reasons for how they explain that. But there were 3 or 4 that were remarkably consistent across the United States, the UK, France, Austria in particular. And those 3 or 4 are the following. So the blaming of trade and globalization, blaming of immigration, rightly or wrongly, right? Blaming of labor policy, but also importantly, blaming of corporations. Yeah. And it was actually quite interesting. Well, I remember at the time when we first published some of this research back in 2016, I remember the FT and the Wall Street Journal obviously took it to the politics and actually observed that, isn't this interesting, that we're in this election year, if you look across the United States, the UK, and France, all the outside candidates, whether they're on the right or the left, are speaking to these issues. Mm-hmm. You could argue Bernie was speaking to the same sort of issues as was Trump, whereas all the establishment candidates were really not emphasizing these issues, whether they're on the right or the left. So I think that was interesting. So I think, to agree with the question, that I think these waves are not just on the right, I think, but this mistrust of institutions. And also, I should also add even the private sector, corporations. We haven't talked about that very much. I think that's part of the picture.
And certainly a lot of U.S. companies, car companies, had moved a lot of jobs to Mexico over the years with very little questioning.
But I think we should be careful about the jobs movement. I mean, Jason and I were in a debate yesterday. One of the things that's, I think, not as properly understood, if you look at manufacturing, which is often associated with sending jobs overseas, if you look at most of the careful studies that have been done on manufacturing about, how much were these job losses driven by jobs moving overseas, The range across those studies is at least 13%. The highest study that I've seen, it says about 28%. No one is claiming it was 90%. They say how much of those jobs in manufacturing were lost to going overseas.
I think in the auto industry, actually, it's much more plausible that the US wouldn't have an auto industry without the integrated supply chains with Japan and with Mexico and Canada. We would have lost out to Europe and Japan were it not for that, and we'd have fewer jobs in auto manufacturing.
A question right there. Yeah.
Sure. Particularly in this group, but in kind of an enlightened group, it's very hard to like President Trump. I think it's even hard for his wife to like him. But the what if, in his transactional way of negotiating, this bully attitude is just leading to a splitting of the difference between the very asymmetrical tariffs in the United States that the United States puts on imports and the much higher tariffs that Europe and China put on their imports. What are the chances that this might lead to, okay, because he changes his mind quite rapidly. He loved Melania too. Okay. So what if it goes back and says, I love you guys, we've always been friends. Let's just split the difference. And all of a sudden we have a more symmetrical tariff. What are the chances?
What are the chances, Chad, that it ends well? You wanted to talk about tariffs.
Dude, I'm so sorry the populism discussion got turned into the tariff discussion. But this is a very, very important question because it turns out what he said about tariffs in this asymmetrical structure isn't true. It really isn't true. So I do a weekly podcast on trade policy, and this is my attempt to bring love to the world of globalization. It's generally a positive vibe. It's called Trade Talks. I'd invite you to go listen to it. We just did an episode on this 2 weeks ago. When you actually look at the data, the United States doesn't actually look all that different from the European Union. It does. China has a bit higher tariffs, but they're still a much, much poorer country than we are, and their tariffs are much lower than all other countries out there at the same sort of level of development. Yes, China could do better. We could be engaging with them on there, but again, this is another one of these things that President Trump doesn't quite, fully articulate all of the nuanced aspects of.
Neither does The Economist. Mm. Got an article on that.
Mm. Actually, my podcast co-host, might have been a different article, is a journalist for The Economist, and I'll send it to you afterwards. She actually did. She walked through the arguments for how he got it exactly wrong. So, yeah.
Okay, in the back there, and then right here. We have time for just a couple more questions.
I've been to several discussions around populism, and not one person has talked about the Congress and their inability, unwillingness, cowardness, poodleness to do anything. And Arthur, I'm totally for love, but we have a love deficit in Congress.
Anyone want to take that? Have we just given up hope in Congress?
So can I actually, one of the odd things from a trade person's perspective is the actual reversal here and what you need, right? So it's, historically you've had a very protectionist Congress and you've had presidents that were sort of very open, and it's very different obviously with President Trump. And if the United States is going to actually withstand this moment of protectionism, it is going to be due to Congress. We haven't actually seen them really step up to the plate on this yet, but there are hints of it here and then. And so, but in general, I agree with you. I was just looking for something positive to say about it.
Jason, I can't resist asking you about this question, having worked in the Obama administration, looking at the increasing political polarization around the country. Do you see hope? I mean, it obviously is directly related to the populism.
When I look anywhere but Congress, I see all sorts of hope. And I'm serious. Some of my close friends, well, Arthur and people that work for him at AEI, we could solve an awful lot of these problems very quickly together and agree on quite a lot. And, this isn't an issue we're discussing here, but take the issue of climate change. almost every economist, former Secretary of State from Democratic or Republican administrations thinks we should have a carbon tax. Really easy, we get rid of a lot of regulations, we could rebate the money to people, we could have a border adjustment, et cetera. About the simplest piece of legislation we could imagine, but it just seems very, very far from things like that happening in Congress. But I do actually feel that there's been more convergence in the dialogue among sort of policy wonks outside in a way that may at some point help, but not yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me stick up for Congress for 2 seconds, even though it's the most unpopular position. But then again, I've become the weird love guy. So in this, before I came to DC, I had this view that they were all takers and self-interested and opportunistic and all that. And I've been shocked in the last 10 years since I've led an institution in DC at how sincerely patriotic and interested that they are in trying to solve problems. Here's the problem. As a matter of just the political science of populism, populism is not a form of leadership, it's a form of followership. When you see a parade going down the street and you go jump in front of it and say, I'm the leader, you're a populist leader. That's how it works. That's how political candidates on the right and the left, they get elected. I'm not so sure about Mexico. I'm pretty confident that's probably the case. There's a parade going down the street, and the guy certainly is the case in presidential politics, but it's also the case that we have a big collective action problem in Congress. Like I have close personal friends in the Congress, and I talk to them, and they hate it as much as you do, but they don't know what to do because they fight against that, they lose, and then the next person, man or woman who comes in, who wins, is more of a populist. So that collective action problem ordinarily has one solution to it, which is true leadership, and it's true leadership at the executive level. So the way that states have sorted this out when they've had populist insurgencies at the state and local policy is they've had an executive who sort of a Mitch Daniels type, a solve the problem type, let's all be in it together type. And the way that actually comes about is because you have a popular upsurge in demand for something that brings the country back together. So what we actually need is in essence, a different kind of populism, a kind of ethical populism in which we're demanding no longer to be terrorized by 30% of the population, in equal measure on both sides, who tell us that we must hate our neighbor if they disagree with us. And the 70% of us who don't like it, we need to start demanding more executive leadership. And downstream from that, the ones who will be most relieved are the members of Congress.
We have time for one last question, and I'm going to ask our panelists to have some final thoughts because we need to wrap up.
Question for Arthur on his dignity question and point, and I'd love to get Arthur's perspective and anyone else on the panel. So, what specific ideas would you have that we could propose changing our current social welfare transfer payment system that would encourage dignity, also address, the disenfranchised workers, increase the labor participation rate so we get better training? What specific, simple ideas that would appeal to the 70 to 80% of the population that maybe we can approach both sides that is a real practical solution to moving this ball forward?
Thanks, and I'll go quick. The basis of dignity is that work works. That's the basis of dignity. And when people are not working and they're not contributing, they won't feel needed. This is the problem in dignity. So any policy that creates incentives for people to not work and contribute are bad policies. Now, there's a lot of room on the right and left for disagreement, whether or not we should have more incentives baked into our welfare transfer payment system with work requirements. That's a complicated business. But one of the things that Jason said is exactly right. Look, this is something that President Obama strongly believed, and everybody on the right strongly believes, is an expansion of the earned income tax credit because it makes work pay. Now, one of the things to probably not do, that's a dangerous thing, is a universal basic income, because that incentivizes, that creates a basis that is not based on work. And again, that's controversial, even what I just said. But these are real life, work inducements. One key way to think about it, which is this: it's if you have two ways you can look at people at the margins of society. You can look at them as liabilities to manage, or you can look at them as assets to develop. Okay, now we've gone from seeing people at the periphery of society as assets to our economy and to our communities as liabilities to manage. We have a liability-based welfare system, a liability-based social system in this country. And until we actually turn that around and say, by the way, it's super expensive to see poor people as assets. Because you have to think about their education, you have to think about their family life, and you have to think about how they're going to get their welfare payments, that it doesn't create, fragment their communities and do all this bad stuff that we do to them. But until we do that, we're going to be in the same soup that we're in today. Assets, not liabilities.
Quickly going down the line, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
In the long run, I'm actually optimistic. Because I think to go back to your original question, Rebecca, I actually think, you asked the question at the beginning of this, which is it culture, is it economics? I actually think it's both. I think what we had was a confluence of both things happening at the same time, and that actually is what magnified what has happened. But I'm actually optimistic in the long run. I think part of it is a big part of what Arthur's talking about, which is how do we talk to each other and actually try and solve problems? So I'm with the Love crew here.
Love wins the debate, like always.
I too am optimistic, just in the sense that I think we're talking a lot about these things today, hopefully in public at least, more fluently than we have in the past. The last substantive point that I wanted to make is to actually just follow up on this question, which was, these are exactly the kinds of questions that we need to be focusing on. And so from an international, trade organization kind of perspective, what I would have people ask of me is, do these trade agreements prevent us from being able to do the kinds of things that Arthur or Jason or James, all the people that are experts on the domestic policy would want us to do? And my answer to that is no, right? The NAFTA, the World Trade, they don't prevent us from actually taking responsibilities and actually developing the domestic policies that we need to help our workers. And if they were to start doing so, that would be a problem. But they don't currently, and I think that's a good thing.
How worried are you about the trade war?
I'm extraordinarily worried about the trade war. So I'm generally optimistic, but I'm really worried about the trade war.
So I'm more concerned, and I think there are two reasons. One is just the deadlock in the gridlock, the myopia, the short-termism that we see in business, that we see in politics, that we see, and that isn't prepared to confront the topics and the solutions that we're talking about here today. The second thing is that when you talk about the US context, I think it's very easy to imagine that Trump is a populist president. This is just an aberration, and then after this first term, we're gonna have someone who's like Obama or someone else who seems more predictable and more, has greater belief in the institutions. If you look at places like, there are places like Italy, when you have someone like Silvio Berlusconi leaves the scene, you actually see an even more polarized electorate, an even more polarized political system where populism on both sides is actually very powerful and the middle falls away. And so I think over the long run, I'm probably as optimistic as James and everyone else. But in the short term, I think it's too easy to be fooled into thinking that this is an aberration and reasonable minds will prevail.
I try to be rational and fact-based. I also try to be optimistic, and there's sometimes some tension between those two impulses.
I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists for a fascinating discussion.